All right. Um, Welcome everyone to today's event on the future of cloud computing. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm a senior analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and the director of our new Center for Data Innovation. Just so you know, today's event is being webcast live. We're also recording a video of it, which will be posted on our website following this event. If you are participating remotely, you're welcome to send in questions via Twitter using the hashtag IKIF, and we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end if you're in the room. Just as a few kind of framing remarks, I remember a few years ago, if you tried to talk to people about cloud computing, most people would kind of stare at you with this blank face and have no idea what you were talking about. And I think this is changing, but people still have many questions about cloud computing and how this will impact customers, consumers, businesses, and government. And so hopefully with today's panel, we'll be able to address some of these questions, especially the ones that keep occurring. We have an exceptionally knowledgeable panel here today, and what I've asked each of them to do is to spend about 10 to 15 minutes sharing their vision of how cloud computing will evolve over the next 5 to 10 years, and then describe some of the types of opportunities and challenges that these changes will likely present. Starting far on my left here, let me just briefly introduce our panelists. They all have their bios, the full bios up online on our website. Max Peterson is Director and General Manager for Amazon Web Services Worldwide Public Sector. Max is a public sector industry veteran with over 25 years of experience, including prior executive management positions at both Dell and CDWG. Melvin Greer is a Senior Fellow and Chief Strategist of Cloud Computing at Lockheed Martin. He has over 25 years of systems and software engineering experience and is a recognized expert in service-oriented architecture, cloud computing, and gamification. And Jim Blakely leads Intel's Cloud Services Solutions team in the Cloud Platforms Group. Jim beats both of these people. He has 30 years of experience in the computing and communications industries, and for the last 13 years, he has worked at Intel with data center operators and service providers on a wide variety of system solution strategies and technologies. So we're just going to work down the line and then get into a discussion about cloud computing. Jim, why don't we start with you?
Great, yeah, thanks. I'm basically a technologist. I work at one of the largest technology companies in the world, and I think one of the few that is actually present in every single cloud data center around the world. We've been very, very successful over the last several years working with the big cloud service providers as well as a lot of large enterprises. So I think we have a unique perspective on where cloud computing is going. One of the things I wanted to do today was spend a couple minutes on, why did cloud computing grow the way it has over the last almost 20 years or so, and based on why it's been growing, what do we see going forward in terms of how can we continue the growth? So I want to give you a little bit of a perspective on the why. So the big reason why I believe the cloud's grown is because we've seen a massive decrease in the cost of providing cloud services, and in conjunction with that, a great improvement in the reliability and quality of cloud services. And they've been so accessible and so low cost that people have adopted them very, very, very quickly. That quick adoption has led to a lot of new service and device innovation, and that circle of services and device innovation, increasing lower cost, better reliability, has led to dramatic growth. So let's, oops, should I get this? All right, so this is just a quick analysis that I did a few weeks ago, looking at what has been the trend here. And if you look at what it takes to deliver a service to an end user for cloud, it really takes three pieces of technology. It takes a device that they use in their hand. It takes a network that gets them to the cloud service. So think of your AT&T connection or your Verizon connection getting back to a cloud. And it takes a cloud data center sitting at the back end, the Google data center, Amazon data center, one of the others. If you look at the combined cost of these three elements over the last almost 30 years, 18 years, or 20 years, 18 years or so, the cost has come down about 100-fold to provide a typical service. Now, this is an estimate based on a lot of assumptions, but effectively, it's the cost of a PC, it's the cost of broadband access, and it's the cost of a server and storage to be able to provide that service. 100-fold decrease in the cost of something often leads to increased demand. It's basic economics, and that's what we've seen over the course of this interval. And it's come through first a wave of broadband cost reduction as the cost of getting cable access or wireless access has come down dramatically, and followed by a decrease in the cost of the cloud computing as cloud computing has improved over time. But you can see from the chart on the right side that it's starting to slow down at this point. That rate of cost decreases is declining, and that represents risk in terms of the ongoing growth of these services. Now, as a nod to our Amazon colleague here, we have this whole trend has created an enormous amount of economic value. This just picks out 6 companies that have basically been, for the most part, internet pure plays, and tracks their market cap from 1995 up to today. And it's basically $1.2 trillion worth of economic value that's been created in the cloud. This doesn't include all the other companies that have benefited from this trend. So massive economic value as these services have rolled out. There's still quite a few challenges, though, in terms of offering services from a technology perspective. We've seen a number of outages of important cloud services. We see security breaches, privacy breaches that have happened, and we see challenges with performance and quality, and this allows people or causes people to not want to use those services as much. These continue to improve all the time, but they still are challenges for us as cloud computing continues to grow. But in spite of that, we haven't seen a slowdown in the rate of innovation, in the rate of new services and devices that are coming to market and being offered and getting adopted. And frankly, looking forward at the number of opportunities that are out there for new services in autonomous cars, and cloud robotics, 3D printing, and an enormous number of new opportunities that exist for new services to be deployed. We also see very, very innovative devices, Google Glass being one of the most public ones, but lots of others. My favorite is this little Android toaster over here. I don't know what anybody's going to actually do with an Android-based toaster, but it is an interesting one, and I'm sure somebody will come up with something useful for that. And we don't see this declining anytime soon. And there's some particular areas that I personally feel are big growth areas. If we look at kind of where things are going to play going forward, there's a number of trends here that we think will generate lots of new services, lots of new ideas, lots of technology innovation. The first is in perceptual computing. It's the ability to interact with your cloud service through more human, natural means. We're all familiar with gestures for pinching and expanding and swiping, and we're familiar with Siri and other speech recognition vehicles. This area will continue to grow as the technology improves and gets better, and we get better cameras to be able to do things where you don't actually have to touch the screen. So a lot of growth in this in terms of the ways that people will interact. There are a lot of pervasive applications, and we hear a lot about Google Glass and other wearable kinds of technologies, but there are also embedded applications for the Internet of Things and the ability for different entities to connect and to provide data and provide control over industrial environments, manufacturing environments, logistical environments. This area will grow dramatically as well. And we'll see some continuing innovation in personal devices and personal services as the devices more if it becomes cheaper and easier to create a new device. New applications will come up. That little picture there was a little personal robot that was actually presented at one of the TED conferences not too long ago, where it's an ability to have your own little personal assistant that rolls around your house and it does things for you. And there are other things where the cloud is just particularly good at being able to do things that you can't do other ways. If you look at, many people don't know that Siri is in fact a service that's predominantly run in the cloud. Most of that is done because it's very easy to run that at scale in a cloud environment. An autonomous car is not really autonomous per se. Much of its information and how it drives and goes comes from a cloud backend service. So those are cases where having that massive amount of computing power available to you leads to new opportunities for services. So we'll see all of these going forward. This is one of my favorites. She looks so happy about that printer. I don't know what that is. That's a 3D printer that you can actually download the plans for and print it. It can pretty much print itself. You have to self-assemble it and put it together, but it does allow you to create a new printer just like the old one. But it looks like a toy now, and that often winds up having these things dismissed. But when these 3D printers are under $600, you can build this one here for about $600 or so. And admittedly, that's not an industrial grade printer by any stretch, but as the price of those come down, it's going to have a dramatic effect on manufacturing. It's relatively slow in terms of how long it takes to print something out, but for custom devices in remote locations, it'll be a great way to get things there quickly. So you will see this have a profound effect on how manufacturing happens. It can only happen if there's a back-end cloud service that provides lots of 3D models that can be used for printing. There's no scale opportunity unless you have a back-end that can do that sort of thing. So what are some of the implications? Well, from an industry perspective, we need to continue the technology innovation cycle here. We need to continue to bring the cost down, get the quality up, make sure that the privacy and security concerns are addressed, and that we're continuing to provide new services out into the marketplace. I am certainly not a policy expert, but I think there are a few areas here where policy really matters. As I mentioned, one of the reasons this has happened is because of the dramatic decline in the cost of broadband access, and I didn't mention ubiquity, but the growth of the deployments of broadband access has been an enormous driver of cloud growth. That needs to continue, and needs to continue to scale out to many, many, many more people, and much more capacity and performance, and this is all gated by public policy, license availability, and cost structure. The second one here, and most of you are much more expert in the privacy and security concerns here. I know that's a close to your heart now. That's right. But this clearly is probably the most complex issue and one of the most important for continuing the growth of cloud computing going forward. I don't know what the right answer is, but there absolutely needs to be a logical, well thought through, and implementable set of policies around this space. It's absolutely key going forward. And then the third one is that I do feel, and this is very much a personal perspective, that we haven't taken as much advantage of the capabilities of cloud to do public good, in particular in areas like healthcare and transportation and medicine, where the opportunities to use this enormously capable, cheap set of resources to do profound good for society has just not been well exploited. And I think that's something that we absolutely should be doing going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys.
Okay, so I'm going to stand up. You know, I'm a university professor, so when you stand up, people have a tendency to see you better. So again, I'm Melvin Greer. I'm a senior fellow at Lockheed Martin. I'm chief strategist. We've been working on the development, and I've actually been putting together our cloud practice since 2008. And so for me, this discussion and question about what is the future of cloud computing is extremely appropriate. Now, we've had this discussion about Cloud 1.0, which is what is cloud computing. And since then, the federal government, as an example, has established a cloud-first policy. Now we have every agency in the federal government experimenting with cloud computing. We have a shared services model where they're actually starting to share cloud services and cloud capabilities. We have a cloud security framework and risk authorization and management program that is now able to definitively define what cloud computing security is, determine whether it exists, and certify and approve people for the distribution and consumption of cloud services in a very secure environment. So where are we going now? I'm going to have a very brief conversation with you about 3 areas, mostly what we think is going to happen in the first 5 years or so, what some of the real evolutionary issues will be, and then what some of the challenges and opportunities are. So, first of all, I don't like to make predictions beyond 5 years because, things that are only 5 years old have made a significant impact on us. If you think about it, most of the channels that we take for granted, like YouTube and Facebook and Vine and Instagram, all these things, they aren't even 5 years old. So what's going to happen 20 years from now is going to be very difficult to actually predict. But for sure, in the next 5 years, these are the kind of things that you can absolutely expect as a result of the adoption of cloud computing. And by the way, this is not specific to government, but for sure, we have this concept of now always on government. I mean, we're in a shutdown right now, but in fact, government is actually always on. It is going to be a 24/7 operation, global in nature, with access and delivery of citizen services that are accessible by the citizen almost from anywhere. And that's significant and important. I certainly agree with my colleague Jim that we can do more work in areas of healthcare and energy and defense and all these other great societal problems. And in fact, I can assure you that the federal government is looking at that. When we talk to defense and civilian and intelligence agencies, absolutely for sure, they are examining how to employ cloud computing services and all the benefits that Jim talked about in terms of lower cost and speed to market and the ability to drive change. They're absolutely looking to take advantage of that. And you as citizens can expect to have a direct impact on how that works. If you don't think so, all you need to do is start engaging government in cloud computing channels and environments. So we already have ways for you to send a direct message to people in government. If you and all of your friends get together, the Congress of the United States will be responsible for responding to whatever issue you have that you think is important. And this is something brand new. This is a great thing. I think the other thing that you'll see without question in the next 5 years, and this is again not specific to government, is this focus on advanced and rapid failure. Now, we talk about rapid failure sometimes as a negative, but in reality, speedy failure is a driver for innovation and solution development. And so what cloud computing does is it lowers the amount of time from idea to actual implementation, such that you can fail thousands and thousands and thousands of times much faster than you could ever have done in the past, which leads you to the best possible solution in a much earlier and faster time frame. So this speed to failure concept is associated with cloud, a critical success factor in its adoption. And then lastly, the way that we talk and collaborate is going to change significantly. And now when we want to do some sort of conversation around a subject, we can establish a global audience in minutes. My wife, she runs a business responsible for cooking, teaching little kids how to cook. So she harvests food out of our garden, they come into my house, and then they prepare the food, and then they eat it, and then they learn how to eat their vegetables and all kinds of garden stuff. But her goal was to try and connect with homeschool moms, all kids and their families, neighborhood families, people who have organic concerns, people who want to talk about GMO foods. And she was able to do that without actually leaving her office in our house and be able to make significant contributions to this discussion about how food is looked at and viewed and consumed and evaluated. And every citizen will be able to have this kind of contribution to whatever subject that they care about. It is great that we have this large-scale collaboration, but cloud computing is also driving us to this idea of a market of one. And if you haven't felt this yet, you certainly will. What cloud computing is allowing marketing and retail organizations is to drive significant communications directly to you, not to people like you, or not to all the people that you've profiled, but to you specifically. So as an example, you go to the doctor, you give a blood sample, you're going to get a drug, not for the 100 million people who have diabetes, or the 100 people who fit your profile for diabetes, but for your specific genome. And that happens with cloud computing. What it really also provides is a new understanding of what we're going to call business agility. It provides us an opportunity to showcase how fast we can move in ways we couldn't have moved before. And this will have a significant impact on how businesses are put together and how fast they actually are able to deliver solutions that matter to their constituency. Now here's my tagline for the day. So if you don't remember anything else, this is it. Death to cloud computing. So I wrote a book on cloud computing. I'm responsible for our cloud computing program and practice. I look across 4,000 projects, about $7.5 billion worth of work that's focused on cloud computing, and I'm ready to kill the discussion about cloud. And the reason I'm ready to kill the discussion about cloud is because it mirrors this discussion and confuses the discussion in ways that we just really don't need to. Cloud computing in the next 10 years will be just computing. It will be the way we think about computing, in exactly the same way as we thought about computing 10 years ago as some device that sat on your desk. Now, if you don't believe me, we sponsor the Science and Engineering Festival here in Washington. About 2 million kids come. You ask them, what is computing? What is your idea of what computing is? And what do you think they say? This is the interactive part of the discussion. What do you think they say?
Video games. Video games?
Yeah, video games, that's right. What else?
Tablets.
Tablets, that's right.
Facebook. Facebook.
Facebook, that's right. So all of these things are exactly what computing is. That's not, none of those are wrong. All of those are absolutely right. To the user experience, the gamer, the player, computing is the device that they have interfaced the computing system to, or the application they run via the computer, or the thing that they want to do with it. So from my perspective, cloud computing is going to go away because of this significant faction and focus on always on, hyperconnectivity, and personal situational awareness. Now, all of these things sound quite technical, so let me give you a non-technical view of what cloud computing will do in this context. First, it will change the concept of leadership in every organization that we find ourselves working in today. New 21st century leaders must get their handle on this kind of worker, because this kind of worker has a different set of expectations than the people who came to work when I started working at Lockheed. They have a different way of doing their work. They have a different way of organizing their work, finding value in their work. And so because of that, a new leadership model will emerge. This idea of workforce and talent, significant and important. And if you aren't feeling the impact of this workforce and talent war that we're in already, then I think you will. Second, we've already talked about some of these ideas about harnessing the disruptions in technology, and we'll continue to feel that as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about the long-term future. And then the last part is this idea of developing an innovation engine or an innovation culture. The evaluation and ability to do that will have a significant impact on cloud adoption and how organizations actually go about implementing cloud computing. So, some opportunities and challenges. So, I thought about this. My My 5-year-old, he's a Philadelphia lawyer. I hope there's nobody from Philly here. I like Philly, but that's the thing, you get people who are negotiating all the time. So he's negotiating all the time. He's always looking for the deal, and he's only 5. It's great. I don't know where he got that from. But anyway, when I talked to him about challenges, he says, Daddy, challenges are just opportunities for me to do something different. And I said, yeah, okay, I can buy into that. So challenges are opportunities. And so here are some of the ones that I think are important to think about. First, the opportunities. We will have a transformation in research and development in a way that we've not seen before. Uh-oh. Yes, thank you. So research and development will certainly transform. I'm in research, and I can tell you right now that everything we do in research has changed. Everything from the development of the idea, to funding it, to being able to collaborate with researchers around the world, being able to test, evaluate it, and then create a value chain to bring it to market. This year I've been working on synthetic biology. It's a core research area at Lockheed Martin. And so it's the idea of applying the same rigor to the genetic code as we have in software code. And so when you think about it, there's only a few people on this planet who know how to do synthetic biology. And you can be able to organize and get them in a virtual setting quickly. You can drive change and implement biofab bricks based on genetic responsibilities and functions. You can organize those in a repository and so on. So the ability to transform R&D is certainly something going to happen soon. The development of a level playing field. You will not have small business be at a disadvantage anymore. Government is already starting to realize that, and I think across all industries, the ability of small businesses to disintermediate large markets will be pervasive. And then this idea of leapfrogging, certainly a big deal, because leapfrogging is one of the core benefits that cloud computing adopters are looking to do. They want to maximize their ability to get access to funding, to drive technology change, to implement that and get market share through those concepts of cloud. The challenges are absolutely clear, and like the ones that Jim talked about. First of all, your idea of what data is will change. Right now, data might be something amorphic to you, something that's outside of you as the individual, but you will be a walking advanced sensor. You will have walking advanced sensors on you. You already have that in the terms of your handheld devices and your mobile devices, but you'll be driving in one, they will be tracking you, and you, in fact, will be the primary data source people are trying to tap into. And you will have a different mindset associated with them. The second discussion around privacy. No question about it, this is probably one of the most significant and complex issues associated with the adoption of cloud computing in the future. Now notice I didn't say security. I do believe that security and privacy are different, right? So privacy is something that happens when it's a legal thing. It's not a technical thing. And of course, security is something that somebody with a security certification or a set of security tools can provide you. They can't provide you privacy. And then the last thing is this huge disruption capability across all sectors, and we'll constantly see that. All of this activity is driving to one thing and one thing only, and that is innovation. This idea of being able to drive directly to innovation as fast as possible, with the least amount of effort and the least amount of capital is significant. And what we will see is this collapse, this convergence of these various silos today. These silos of cloud, mobile, social, and big data will collapse. And the people who are able to harness these disruptive innovations will be the ones that will be more successful. So that is, I believe, the end of my discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we're going to control that. I don't know if that's
Oh.
going to work.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. So I can just say next slide?
Yeah.
Or bigger slide, I can say first?
It's a voice actor.
That's awesome. That's the future.
And it's got fingerprint recognition.
Okay, well, I tell you what, you're eventually going to get a slide, but I don't actually need that to start talking, so I'll go ahead and start talking. And I've got to start off and probably badly paraphrase Mark Twain when I say I think that Melvin's report of the death of cloud computing is a bit exaggerated. In fact, next slide. Just to kind of frame this, I always think it's interesting when you're talking about the future of something, and yet when we move forward one slide, what you're going to see there is that Amazon Web Services, thanks to both my panelists here, recognized as the leader in cloud computing is 7 years young. In fact, it was just on March 14th of 2006 that Amazon Web Services announced the very first, the very first offering that we had, which is our storage, cloud computing storage offering called S3. So it is kind of fun to sit here and talk about the future of something when its birth is actually so recent. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to do before we got into some of the where are we going pieces is to just quickly frame cloud computing. If I had time, I'd love to ask everybody in here for their definition of cloud computing, because I always think it's fascinating. Whether we think of it in terms of a consumer, or if we think about it in terms of a business, or if we think about it in terms of government or education, or how I think of it sometimes is as a technologist. And the thing that is really amazing is that when you look at what Amazon Web Services has put together for our offering, and we do call it Amazon Web Services. I'm glad that we didn't call it Amazon Cloud Computing. So that's actually important, because one of the driving items here is that you're able to think of this as a collection of services that are modular and that you assemble and put together in a fashion that meets your specific needs. So it isn't one monolithic cloud thing. It's actually this global set of building blocks that businesses and government and education and individuals and students use to put together to meet their specific needs. And it falls into some fairly broad categories. It falls into an immense amount of computing capability that spans a wide range of functions. It falls into networking capability that gets you around the world, literally, in milliseconds. It falls into huge storage capabilities. Everybody here, I'm sure, is well aware of the pace of which data is growing. And Amazon, in fact, in our cloud storage offering, just exceeded over 2 trillion objects stored. So there's an immense amount of data that's being generated, and the cloud delivers an immense amount of capability to store all that and process it. And then there's database services, there are other application services, and then there's a lot of things that we use to control and instrument the cloud, whether it's to control it, to do what I want to do, measure it to make sure that it's highly available, be able to monitor it so that I know that it's highly secure. So the cloud is not this singular monolithic thing. It's really this collection of tools that individuals employ to make it do what they want it to do. Next slide. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the economics, because while this is about the future and we want to talk about capability, one of the underpinnings of cloud computing and the reason it's taken hold, and the reason that I believe when you ask that question about the future that you're going to continue to see it drive this curve is because of scale and economics. And I won't belabor it because both Jim and Melvin talked about it, but that's one of the great things that cloud computing brings to everybody. It's operations at a global scale that delivers continuous cost reductions. And you can look across the industry, and when you look at Amazon, we've reduced prices in that 7 years over 37 times. And that's largely without a lot of competition. It's just because we can continue to drive down the cost by driving up scale. And that makes it less expensive for everybody to use and to imagine these new applications. In fact, next slide. If anybody here in this room really wants a good description of cloud computing, I highly encourage you to look into that Gartner report. It's very, very detailed around infrastructure as a service, and has great comparisons and great analytics in it. It really helps you to understand what's driving some of these things. But here's where we think the future of cloud computing lives. The first is driving global innovation. And global is key there, and innovation is key. It's both in business and in government. And one of the central tenets that really turns things on its head when you talk about computing, when we locked up all our computing inside of our data centers, we had a big cost structure. and it was hard to think about how we were going to do that next new project. When all of a sudden you're talking about computing as a utility, and you can access tens of thousands of cores of computing capacity in a moment's notice, it flips that idea on its head. It really makes innovation the first effort that you undertake. You don't have to spend a lot of time designing, specifying, testing, integrating. Instead, spend more time thinking and trying. And so that's why I think one of the things that cloud computing is going to drive in the future, whether you talk about the private sector or the public sector, is that innovation. The second one that's really interesting to us, and we see it in our customers in many ways over, and I'll touch on some examples, is time to science. The tools that are available and the capacity that anybody from an individual student to a very large organization can access in the cloud absolutely helps them speed up time to science. And then the third thing that I think really the future of cloud computing is driving is the ability for us to unlock human potential. That we've now got access to computing resources on a scale and in an on-demand fashion that we haven't had at any time in the past. Only the largest of organizations or governments could afford massive, massive scale of computing to allow them to answer questions, to allow them to do complex computations, or store and serve up vast, vast amounts of data. And cloud computing takes that and just flips it on its head, because it means that anybody in this on-demand world can have access to those resources. So if you go to the next slide, please. Let me talk for a second about global innovation. Here's 3 examples. There's numerous ones out there. But the basic tenet here is that business and government has been able to rethink how they did their computing to achieve new results. And the keys here are really speed and agility. And that's one thing when we talk about government and education. It's a great potential. Unfortunately, from a policy perspective, one of the things that we need to unlock is how can government and education use cloud computing faster and more flexibly in an era where they're kind of still constrained by old approaches to computing, old policy. There's a number of agencies that are out there breaking new ground. NASA is a great example of one of them. But by using the cloud, business and government has been able to achieve much faster results. One example here is, I think it's on the slide, is Bristol Myers, where they were doing clinical drug trials and they needed to do simulation. And previously those simulations had taken 60 hours to complete. And that was because they had a certain amount of in-house infrastructure, a certain amount of storage, a certain amount of compute, a certain amount of network, and that's all the faster they could run that job. So they turned around and they said, let me leverage cloud computing. And they set it up so they could run that same job, and that simulation was completed in just over 1 hour. And so that's the type of speed that you can get when you employ resources in the cloud that you just maybe don't have in-house. And it's not an either or. Many organizations are finding that this is in fact a way that they extend and use their own in-house computing resources. And so for instance, where I can't see my own print here, News International, it's in that deep blue, News International. They were able to go ahead and take a third of their server farm and migrate it to AWS. And that drove a savings in the order of about £1 to £1.5 million. That kind of economic benefit turns around and you can put that money back into your core mission instead of putting it into capital assets like computers and storage. So that's another way that it helps to speed up innovation and speed up agility. Next slide. So here's a couple examples in that time to science realm. And these are pretty exciting too. A lot of times we think about them in terms of big data and high performance computing. But everybody here I'm sure is familiar with the Mars landing from NASA. What you might not be as familiar with is behind the scenes, NASA leveraged AWS to be able to download all of the information that was coming from the rover, move it out to the cloud, and stage it on the cloud in Amazon's global infrastructure so that one, all of that information was available to our global citizens around the world who had an interest in that science. Two, they were able to store that mass amount of information without the in-house resources to do it. And then third, that trove of information was available. It was available for those public mission objectives of NASA for access to the public, but it also then was available to post-process and bring back in-house for the in-house scientists. All of this information was also streamed live around the world when the rover landed, and they could watch all of this without impacting NASA systems in a bit. And one of the other things that's interesting about this is we see some of these cloud workloads are kind of transient, right? And so in the old world, if I had to build all of the infrastructure that it took to run this, I would have had an immense expense, and it would have been used for a short period of time, and then it kind of would have gone into more of a steady state operations. On the cloud, this activity can scale up rapidly and then can go and scale back down to a normal steady state. So it makes very efficient use of resources, and it's very, very cost effective. NASA and JPL have gone on record several times talking about how they were able to do this in a very cost-effective fashion by leveraging the cloud. Another example is in terms of genomics and cancer research. Whether you talk about Harvard University or you talk about Georgetown, they all have great case studies where they're able to actually do their science faster, do their research and their simulations and their modeling faster, because they're able to use the cloud and expand dynamically and then shrink back down to a scale of just ongoing operations. Some of the examples on the slide there give you a feel for the economics. I'll just call out one of them, this is really one of those drivers when you think about it. Think about the cost of a 30,000 core supercomputer, and you're talking millions of dollars. And yet on Amazon, when this job was run for a particular simulation, it came out to $1,279 an hour. So when you think about the amount of science that you can achieve when you can run cloud computing apps on that economic or cost curve versus the multi-million-dollar data center cost curve, that the opportunities are huge. Next slide. The last one I think is really interesting is when you think about how the cloud helps to democratize computing. I've talked a couple of times about the traditional data center where that asset was locked up and very expensive. When you think about the human genome, one of the things that's interesting is there's such huge potential to unlock government research there for the better good, but the amount of data that was involved, over 250 terabytes, was such that, again, you couldn't get that information unless you had a very big system that you could pull that information in and stage it on. And so through a partnership with AWS, what we did was we said, hey, let's put that information out in the cloud. And if we move that information out into the cloud, then it becomes very easy for individuals, researchers, students, or anybody else to conceive of an idea and then go do their computing right by the storage instead of having to have that supercomputer. And so Amazon made this partnership with NIH and also has a more global program called the Public Dataset Program, where these types of valuable public data can be unlocked by putting them in the cloud and then making access to them open, fast, and inexpensive. And there's a link down there on the bottom that you can go to if you'd like to get more information. But with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my remarks and turn it back over to the panel and I think some Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to each of you for your unique perspectives on this. What I want to do is start off with a question for really all of you. Because whenever I talk to people about cloud computing, it inevitably gets to questions about security. And as each of you has described, there are enormous benefits here, and it's clear that organizations are adopting cloud computing. But what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes and ask you, how does cloud computing change the risk profile for organizations, and what do executives in business and in government need to understand about the security of cloud computing? And Jim, let me start with you, and then we'll just work down.
Sure. As I said during my remarks, it's one of the more complicated topics out there, particularly in aggregate. We know those comments, security and privacy, are different, and we tend to think about them the same way. But if I just look at security and where it's going in the cloud, I'll reference AWS a bit here. So if you look at where security has been in enterprise computing over the last 30 years or so, it has been, let me call it a do-it-yourself job. People have had to figure out on their own in each individual company how to best apply security for their own purposes, and it's been a very, very expensive proposition to figure out first of all what your policies are, how you're going to define compliance, and it's and then put in all the infrastructure required to be able to implement those policies. One of the things with cloud is that ultimately the ability for an AWS, for example, to spend the energy, effort, and dollars to put in best-in-class security is far greater than any individual company's ability to do, any individual enterprise company. And therefore, we can see a time when the top cloud service providers will be able to provide superior security, superior compliance services, superior reporting capabilities to what any enterprise company could do themselves. And we're in a period now where, as Max said, it's 7 years young, and it's growing very, very rapidly, and it's evolving very rapidly. All these companies, all the large service providers are looking at it, as well as further down the spectrum in terms of how they offer better and better and more targeted security services, privacy services. So we will see it get there just because economically it has to happen. I think the bigger challenges are going to be in understanding what the right new policies are for any individual company and for nations. As we all know right now, that's a major issue. And working through that regulatory policy morass is going to be the big stumbling block.
Yeah, so Lockheed Martin is a cybersecurity company. And so this question is not an academic one for us. We spend almost every day working and focusing on cyber and cybersecurity, both in enterprise and cloud. And there are a couple of important trends to think about. Well, first, let me just recognize AWS for their FedRAMP certification at the agency level. Lockheed Martin was the very first system integrator and large company to achieve this FedRAMP certification, which certifies that the federal government understands as a cloud provider, we are able to meet every one of the government's cloud security requirements. Having said that, there are a couple of important things to think about, and this is what executives and agency leaders think about. First, the rethinking of the security mindset associated with cloud is required. In the past, we had this layered defense in-depth strategy. It was based on this idea that we could control all of our enterprise assets, and that control would allow us to apportion various enterprise assets, authenticate and authorize people as we would like. When we deal with cloud computing in a more distributed model, this architecture needs to change significantly. Because now we have assets that we are using to compose solutions that are not in our control. They're not inside our firewall. They're not inside our enterprise, and yet we are responsible for continuing to provide a security framework that extends to all those assets. I think the most significant area of concern around security is moving away from this infrastructure area, which is where the focus has been in the past, and moving directly into data. It's this fusion of cloud, mobility, big data, and social that is causing this shift. And so significant among all of the issues is data sovereignty. Who owns it? Who will be able to control access to it? And how will we be able to harness the power of the data so that we can actually deliver the solutions in this broad-scale, distributed global model?
Let me just see if I can add three things without repeating. The first one is that at a practical level, and I'm saying this at a practical level, most organizations get better security in the cloud. And it's quite simply for the reason that Jim mentioned. Organizations that are in the business of delivering high-scale cloud computing are investing in the people, tools, and processes to automate that. So at a practical level, I think there's actually a lot of benefit that many companies gain right there by using the cloud to improve their own security. The second thing I would tell you is when you look at different cloud computing providers, I would say make sure that you ask for their compliance and standards. So the first measure is have these firms achieve the compliance and standards and audits required. FedRAMP, as Melvin mentioned, for U.S. federal government, but also there's a number of industries that have their own specific standards with audit and compliance. PCI, payment card industry, motion picture industry. So secondly, look for your providers to have met and achieved those standards that are important for you. And then thirdly, cloud computing is a shared security model. And what that means is understand exactly what your cloud computing provider does in terms of their security. Where does it start? What do they do? How do they handle it? And importantly, where do they hand it off to you or your system integrator who's doing that work for you? Where is that handoff? Because at that level, then it's the responsibility, for instance, when you talk about the data piece of it. If that data is really valuable and really important to you, then you ought to have an encryption plan, both for that data at rest and that data in motion. You ought to have a multi-factor authentication plan in place. Those are things, though, that happen and they're decisions that you make as you're using the cloud. Your cloud provider needs to support those things, but in this model, it is a shared security model, and you need to understand where it is that your provider takes care of things for you and where you need to pick up.
So after all of the recent revelations about NSA surveillance and the activities that have been going on, we've seen a number of countries such as Brazil, France, and Germany increasingly raising the idea of requiring data centers to be built within their country, requiring maybe data residency laws. And I raise this because this obviously has an impact on cloud computing and how it was traditionally designed. And so for the panel, and I'll again make this open to whoever wants to respond. First, one of the objectives is that this will make data more secure. Is that true or not? Can you respond to that? And also, how will this long-term impact the cloud computing business model?
I'll go ahead. We're going to sort of work democratically here, so I'll start down at this end. So the first thing is, the people's concerns about the security of their data is really nothing new, whether you're talking about it being inside your organization or outside your organization. And so that's exactly why I was talking about the shared security model. And you need to think through what the importance or value of your data is, whether it's inside your enterprise or in the cloud or running over the internet. You need to think about the importance and value of your data, and then you simply need to architect a solution to support it. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. A solution that some of our partners have developed, Lockheed Martin and many others, they've developed multi-factor authentication and encryption routines so that before that information ever goes into the cloud, you've already locked it up and scrambled it so that even if somebody were to get it in the cloud, all they get is a bunch of ones and zeros. In the simplest format, that's one of the ways that organizations around the world protect information when it's going through the internet or when it's running on the cloud. A number of Amazon services, if you choose not to take that approach and encrypt your data, a number of Amazon services give you an option to encrypt it right there in the cloud, like Amazon Storage. And then Amazon has an offering that's called HSM, which is a hardware security module. And so right at the edge of our clouds, we put these devices, again, to give customers the option to implement as much security in the cloud as they want. We put those devices at the edge where they get to control part of that device themselves. Amazon doesn't. It sits on our cloud, but the end user controls it. And that's where they can choose key storage and key management. I don't mean to be overly technical, but it's another way to facilitate customers' use of cloud services to make it appropriate for the data that they want to exchange.
So I really like that discussion. But you've asked the question as if it's a security question, Daniel. But it has nothing to do with security. This is a privacy discussion that you're trying to have now. And those countries, let me just first say for the record, I have no intention of commenting or providing any direct comment on what's happened with our government and specifically the intelligence organizations. But what I will say is simply this, that when it comes to data privacy and data sovereignty, it's not a security issue. People aren't concerned about their data because it's not encrypted or because it's not in a place where they know where it is. They're concerned because in Europe, in the countries that you identify, there's this concept of a citizen-centric privacy policy, where the data about an individual is absolutely private. That is to say that even the government is not allowed to have access to that kind of information about a person. Now this is born out of a historical understanding about privacy in those countries. If you lived in a country where your parents or your grandparents were murdered because they were subscribing to a magazine, or your entire family was sent off to some prison because of an organization or union, or because of a neighborhood or some sort of family genetic or heritage, then you are going to have a completely different view of privacy than when you live in a country where there's a predisposition to share information. So like you, Daniel, I could sit here on my iPad, I can find out where you work, your driver's license number, what kind of car you have, how much you spent on your house, how much did you pay in taxes. These kinds of things are secure. They are not private. And our view of privacy in this country is a little bit different. And so what is coming to fruition because of the adoption of cloud computing at a global scale is a need to harmonize an understanding of privacy. What is it going to mean when I say something is private from a legal perspective? And Congress is already starting to take a look at updating the 1967 Data Privacy Act that currently exists and trying to figure out what will we do at a state, local, and federal level with privacy laws that are in many ways diametrically opposed to one another. And so, we definitely want to come to grips with privacy.
Let's see what I can add to that. So this issue is not a technology issue. This is a trust issue. And I think one of the biggest challenges here is that the trust model between individuals and their own government, individuals and corporations, and trust between nations and trust between, frankly, between companies is a custom feet on the ground kind of problem. So, for example, if I'm I'll pick a random, if I'm a Swiss citizen, do I trust my Swiss telecom operator with my data? Do I trust the Swiss government? Do I trust Amazon? Who do I, as an individual, trust? And because that is such a fragmented kind of question, it's next to impossible to have a one-size-fits-all answer for the problem. And so you can, I would anticipate we're going to wind up having a very fragmented solution to the problem for a very, very long time. And I don't have any good ideas or suggestions on how that fragmentation could be avoided. But the experts in this space probably could come up with something. But I think we need to think about it in terms of how do I establish trust between the people and the place, the entity that's the keeper of their data.
Great, and I just want to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience, and this kind of extends on this idea of trust that you mentioned here, and that's the concern I think that some organizations have, and I've heard this from organizations in both the public and private sector, say that they fear with cloud computing they might lose control of their data, or that they'll be locked in with one vendor. That they see this as a kind of parallel change that's happening along with these business models. So can you talk a little bit to this concern Is this valid, and to the extent that it is valid, what might organizations do to mitigate that?
Okay, so I can start. I think first, what we're finding is that the predominant model for the adoption of cloud computing is the hybrid cloud model. So people are not putting all their eggs in a private or a public or a community cloud. They're doing exactly what you guys are doing in your personal lives. They're developing fit-for-purpose clouds that do the very specific things that they want to do with that cloud. I want to share photographs with my brother, I use that cloud. I want to send my colleagues an email, I might use another cloud. So that's number one. And what that means is that there's a desire on the part of the cloud consumer to start thinking about how am I going to organize these various clouds so that I don't have the large hurdle when I want to move from one to another. I want to be able to stop using this one and start using that one. And as a cloud provider, I'm then going to get continuous questions from consumers about how to ensure that they can do that. How difficult is it, as an example, for you to move from Gmail to Yahoo Mail or to or Google or some other mail system? You know it can be done. But the question is that you will be asking as a consumer, how difficult is it? Will I lose any integrity in my data? Will I lose any of the granularity and access control associated with it? So having a hybrid cloud model as a starting point is the beginnings of how consumers are starting to think about how to deal with this vendor lock-in and then inability to move from one cloud to another.
Jump ball, I'll take it. All right. So there are two questions. Lose control of your data and lock in. Lose control of your data. I think it's important that you understand, to Melton's point, what's your use case. On AWS, for example, customers own their data. They control where their data is stored. They control how they store their data. They control when they pull their data out of the cloud. So unequivocally, from that perspective, the mileage may vary depending upon your cloud service provider, but there's nothing inherent about cloud computing that means you lose control of your data. You just need to make sure you're controlling it in a fashion that you want to control it. Very similar to decisions you made when you bought in-house solutions. The second thing is when you talk about lock-in, I think that's also important that when you start to use a cloud service, as consumers, we just kind of click on buttons. And in fact, my kids have this bad habit of clicking on buttons, and I'm always having to get them out of the trouble they get into when they click on buttons. But as businesses and as government and as industry, we have to make more informed decisions about when we choose cloud computing options. Whether it's a hybrid computing solution or a singular cloud computing solution that your enterprise lands on, what's really important is you understand that the options that you have once you get on the cloud. And so today when we run databases, we have a lot of different software options. Tomorrow when you architect that solution on the cloud, do you have those same software options? So evaluate the breadth of software support you get. For rapid innovation and rapid development, developers like to have lots and lots of different tools and support lots and lots of different languages. And so when you choose a cloud infrastructure, do you get that sort of multi-vendor, heterogeneous type of support? Or in fact, when you make that selection, are you consciously narrowing down your options? So I would tell you, I don't believe that there's an inherent lock-in problem with cloud computing. I think it's like many things. You have to make sure you understand what you're trying to do, and you have to evaluate those options. And right now, things are moving very fast. And the final thing I'll say about it is there are some new services and new capabilities that the cloud is delivering that aren't available in an in-house analog. For instance, in the realm of big data and data warehouses, the in-house analog required a very expensive computing platform and storage platform and lots of software just to get started with a little bit of data. The thing that cloud computing solutions can allow you to do is flip that paradigm around get started with a small amount of data, but a lot of capability, and then just make decisions along the way about cost and scale and where you want to run. I think as businesses and as government and enterprises, if you make those informed decisions, you'll have just as much flexibility in the future as you would with any other computing choice.
Great. Thank you.
You want to give Jim a chance?
Oh, Jim, I have a couple thoughts. So on
I'll
the,
take it for you.
thank you. So on the do I control my data question, I think there's really two things underneath that. The first is my data going to be used for something that I don't want it to be used for? And the second one is around if I decide I no longer want my data to be in place A, can I pull it out and totally wipe it out in that environment? Both of those issues are contracts between the provider of the data and their cloud service provider. And I think commercial arrangements generally will work that out. So, I could foresee a time, for example, when there's a public advocacy group that's putting pressure on Facebook to make the right options available to people and retain those options. I think those things will generally sort themselves out through normal business and consumer relationships with their entities, with their service providers. On the lock-in question, there will be lock-in. It's human nature that once I get something working in one place, I don't move it unless I'm really, really mad. And we've seen this in, people choose a database provider and they stay with that database provider forever because it's very hard to extract their data from it. So, as Max said, this is nothing new in the technology industry. People don't change unless they absolutely need to. But they always want the option to be able to do that, and typically the most straightforward way to do that is through some set of standards, either de facto standards or sort of the de jure standards where it's actually specified by a body. In cloud, de facto standards tends to be the way things are happening these days. And I will, and once again, refer to AWS. AWS is really now, for at least infrastructure as a service, the de facto standard that everybody refers to. And you see lots of people who are doing their best to, within their legally licensed bounds, to clone Amazon Web Services in whatever form they can. And so, at least at that level, it will ultimately be relatively easy for people to move from one vendor to another. At the higher levels, in platform as a service kinds of levels, or even more stringently at software as a service, it's much harder to move. As Alvin said, you don't move your email provider lightly. It becomes kind of a challenge to move because of the human interface and the data issues with it. And so people will tend to stick with whoever they choose, so long as that provider they feel is not gouging them and is meeting their needs and responds to customer service requests. Right?
We're good.
Yeah, so I'd like to open it up for any questions from the audience. If you could just state your name and organization.
My name is Matt Fusner. I'm with Time Warner Cable. I have a question and a pushback on one concept. My personal belief is that there is no longer a separation between privacy and security. As individual citizens or organizations work through government agencies that take your personal information and then are sourcing it to the cloud, there's a liability issue that swims up here. Being one of those 26 million people that was violated by the VA when they lost a laptop full of data services. Now that people are moving their services from a governmental perspective, and as we expand things like Obamacare and other initiatives to take advantage of the cloud services, I would be curious as to see from a corporate perspective, are there concerns about the liability transference? Because you can only go after government agencies for so much, and they only have so much expertise, which is why they did FedRAMP, to be able to have that trusted environment. But there will be breaches. I mean, cloud security, cybersecurity is never perfect. So it's a matter of if, or it's a matter of when, not if, and then how the leadership within leading cloud service providers is looking at trying to understand that liability, because the fact is that you can define security and privacy very separately, but they've now morphed when you, uninformed give your privacy away to an agency because they have some information, and then they then source that to a third-party entity to control that data when it removes. So it's almost a theoretical question, and I would pose it to the two of you.
I don't think
Mr.
it's
Kruger.
theoretical. First of all, let me say I don't necessarily disagree with you. What I will say is that when you get ready to adopt a cloud service, there's a couple of things that you do that you probably take as one activity, but are really two very separate activities. The very first activity is you get this huge legal document that has an agree button at the bottom. And you might think that that's a security document, and in fact it's not, right? So that's a privacy document. And when you hit agree, then you are then adopting all of the security frameworks that cloud service provides. But they are in fact two different things. If you don't agree, by the way, you know what happens, right? What happens?
Don't go nowhere.
Well, you can't adopt the service. So that's pretty prescriptive. On the area that you said about liability, I think this is a very up and coming and significant thing. You know, so you're a cloud service consumer, and your business depends on a provider. And what happens when that provider, for whatever reason, man-made, natural, or something, goes down, and you're losing several $100,000 every minute? What do you get from the provider?
Nothing. No consequence.
Well, no, you do get something. You can get something. What can you get? I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. But what you generally get is credit for more cloud service. But you don't. But there's no compensation for the business loss that you have. So there is a significant interest in this idea, and insurance companies are looking at providing cloud service liability contracts that allow you to recoup against the business value loss of a cloud service that's been going down. And actually, I spent a lot of time writing on that. There's an article that's published. If you do a search on my name and just put in cloud liability insurance, it'll pop right up.
So then how do you take that to when individuals, U.S. citizens, have, the liability extends involuntarily through a government agency that holds your information that is then on and being held by a platform provider? That is not an agreed to button when you're signing documents, when the United States military and you're providing personal record, PII information, and then it goes up and they have decided to take it outside the bounds of their own confines into a third-party cloud service provider, and then that is the indirect liability exposure that I would be curious as to how it's
I think
addressed.
that this is, we all have this issue, and we all as citizens have the responsibility to interact with our government and raise that issue. I think it's a genuinely serious one, one that we rightly are concerned about, because it is, in my opinion, a part of the privacy half of the same coin.
Right.
And it says if you're going to take my citizen-generated data for the use of processing my driver's license, and then you, because of the process of driver's license processing, inadvertently allow that now to be, given to people that I don't necessarily want to have it, are you going to reimburse me or compensate me for that? That's something that we should and we could bring up, because it's an issue that we definitely could raise as citizens. Because the government, as you, I believe, are describing as a steward of our data.
So Melvin did a great job handling a lot of that. I'll just add a couple of other thoughts. The first one is that the use of the cloud or any technology is something that you make decisions all along the way. I said earlier, as a practical matter, I think most organizations get improved security in the cloud for the reasons that they have a process automation and people that they can afford to it. But somewhere in that chain, something may not be done according to the way that it had been planned. And I think in a lot of cases that falls into the realm of the one part is the contracts, and so you talked about, well, how are the liabilities and things like that flow? Those are typically decided in the enterprise anyhow, different than the click-through. Those are typically decided by very rigorous conversations and discussions about what's the appropriate use, but ultimately it winds up being a risk decision. because you could, usually risk and versus expense. And so if money were unlimited, you could conceive of the Fort Knox of where you were going to put this. But that's really not the real world. And so there's a risk versus cost equation. Amazon can work with you and give you a lot of architectures that reduce risk by encryption, authentication, hardware security modules, all these things. But you also need people and processes to make sure there's not a breakdown. But on the flip side of the coin, one of the things that different cloud providers will do is they offer you different economics. And so AWS has chose to try and keep the cost of cloud computing very low. And therefore, as Melvin said, there are some third parties that will provide liability insurance. And that's, again, one of those risk versus business trade-offs. And so if your application or your use or your economics, drive you to use cloud computing, but you want to use third-party liability insurance to provide some other financial risk mitigation, that's something that we do see customers doing. And the final thing is, I think you'll also see cloud service providers, remember, 7 years young, you'll see cloud service providers continue to evolve their offerings to meet specific industry needs. And so 2 quick examples. AWS has a special region for government customers and contractors in the US. It's called the AWS GovCloud region. It does all of the same security things that the rest of the Amazon cloud does, plus it has a couple of extra features. US persons, FIPS 140-2 endpoints, a offline vetting process for who's allowed to be in that region, so you have sort of a de facto community cloud.
Different auditing and reporting.
Different auditing and reporting. And then there are also some regulatory requirements, and to pick a slightly different sector, in healthcare, there's a regulatory requirement around HIPAA and privacy. And so what you'll find is that organizations, Amazon included, they keep evolving as the policy evolves. And most recently, Amazon's introduced a HIPAA BAA for specific, it's a specific configuration with specific additional controls and monitoring to be able to meet the requirements of that new HIPAA legislation, that just took effect, I believe, in September last month. So I think it is one of those things where you have to be informed, recognize that there's trade enterprises will make trade-offs, individuals too, but individuals, they tend to just click stuff.
But they don't have the financial leverage that the federal government has to create a gov-only cloud. So think about that. What's your name?
Matt.
Matt, can you imagine going to any cloud provider and say, listen, I have some very specific problems that I'm concerned about. I want you to build a cloud service specific to me, and I want you to call it the Matt service. Don't give it to anybody else, and I want you to make sure it meets my very specific requirement. That's not how it happens. You know that. So when we talk about it at the enterprise level, yeah, there's some really big enterprises that have the ability to reorient the discussion. But even if you're a small company, a nonprofit, a school system, a hospital, you don't get a private, virtual private cloud just for your meeting your needs. That's not how it works.
We just have a few more minutes, so let me just take these two. You can just do quick questions, one in a row, and then we'll have them all respond.
Sure. Kelly Lyman, I run the Brazil Southern Cone Practice at McClarty Associates.
The
The Brazil Southern Cone Practice at McClarty Associates.
Okay.
I've either been living or working in Brazil since '94, so you can guess what my question will be about.
Well, no, I asked because I lived in Brazil for 4 years too. So
Yeah. Great place, tough on this issue. No, but here's, Jim, you make the point that this is about a lack of trust, and that's certainly true in the Brazilian case. So I'd just be interested to hear from you all, what do you see as a policy solution, at least, in the medium term? I mean, something that's talked about a lot is modernizing the MLAT process and seeing if we can't have a, more, faster, more consistent flow of information between the governments as one step. I'd be interested to hear what other ideas y'all might have.
If you wanted to add your question, yeah, real quick.
Just do we do rapid questions?
Yep.
Okay. Dan Caprio, McKenna Long and Aldridge. I just wanted to sort of stick to the global theme, I think, of what we're talking about, of and how we protect privacy and security and enable innovation. And I mean, I do think of privacy and security as two sides of the same coin, and that you can't have privacy without security. But Jim, you mentioned in your comments sort of on the continuum, the Internet of Things and machine to machine, and the challenges that we face in terms of notice and choice in the era of pervasive computing, and that we've really got to come up with a new model. That model is broken. I mean, we still have to respect it. So I guess my question is, within your companies, what are you all doing to make sure that your privacy professionals, your security professionals, your engineers, those who manage standards, the traditional silos, that the silos are talking among themselves and working together, so that, because we've got this tremendous opportunity, but we've got the tremendous challenge, but that the silos internally are working together so that we bake privacy and security in at the beginning?
Yeah, so I think this is an easy question for us. We don't build solutions anymore where we have these kind of silos. Security and privacy professionals. Tomorrow I'm spending 2 days getting certified in the federal government's privacy course. So there are no separations in these areas. We spend a significant amount of time understanding the legal, technical, and customer and deployment issues around these in every domain. So that's I think something that you'll find most people are starting to collapse these silos. For yours is a much more important one because it really drives to the political trust and nature of governments. And we already have a precedent, right? So safe harbor is a precedent that a lot of people talk about with respect to how to share data quickly. You guys are familiar with safe harbor, right? So it's the ability for governments to share data about flights and passengers and airlines and so on. This precedent is something that I think is a foundational element and precursor to a much larger discussion around trust. And so when we have these advanced capabilities, it's no longer a matter of can you do something, it's a matter of should you do something, or what's in your best interest to do something. And so these are what I would refer to or frame as political issues that probably will be driven by a set of foundational trust elements built on some of the precedents already set with Safe Harbor, and making a distinction about what you get, what I get, what we share, and how fast that happens.
Jim? I do think it's a political question, and I think it's one that is going to be hard to resolve if we take it country by country. And so I have to think there has to be a global process of some sort to be able to work out the national, nation-to-nation trust, and then underlying that is I'll call it this corporate service provider to nation trust. So for, just to pick on AWS, if AWS wants to put a data center, or you guys probably do have a data center, so.
Sao Paulo.
So does the Brazilian government trust Amazon in Brazil to provide the kind of services that they're looking for? And does Amazon meet the requirements for the global relationship between the U.S. and Brazil? But I think that sort of global framework has to come first, otherwise it will be a country-by-country kind of answer.
Max, you have the last word, 30 seconds.
Great. Policy's imperfect, and paralysis isn't a very attractive option. And so what that means is that we're all going to make do. We're going to use conventions that exist, like Safe Harbor, and Amazon subscribes to Safe Harbor. But also, as enterprises and governments, trust is really important. And Amazon puts security and privacy very high up from an Amazon.com perspective. And from an AWS perspective, it's job one as well. But what you can do to determine whether or not that meets your needs is make sure whoever you choose in this whole computing field, and when you're looking at cloud services, does the organization have the design, control, operations, monitoring, and then audit processes in place? The best you can do is pick the best provider for you. Those are the fundamentals.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panel. And